In this chapter, we are all invited to a 3-day feast where there is an abundance of everything, including 20 fattened deer. Join us as we explore the symbolism behind the overflowing table and what it means for the Wampanoag people. The feast had lasted 2 days. In fact, it was already the third morning that our little band of pilgrims and the tribe of the Massachusetts or Wampanoag had met together at the great table under the spreading branches of the ancient oaks. Every day the table had been laden with more food than the foragers could possibly eat. There were bushels of chestnuts, baskets of blueberries, trays of sweet-smelling dried fish, and jugs of sparkling cider made from the sap of the maple trees. At midday, when the sun climbed highest in the sky, they feasted on cornmeal porridge, served piping hot in earthenware bowls so large that it took 4 men to carry them. The porridge would have been cooked in a big iron pot over a fire pit filled with glowing embers, seasoned with the fat of deer, which the foragers had hunted during the previous winter. Deer were plentiful, so there was enough meat for everyone, and though the pilgrims quickly learned not to waste any food, they could take only so much at each meal, and then the rest would be given to the others. Even after eating until their bellies ached and then some, there were always leftovers. So by the end of the second day, there were 5 great kettles full of porridge remaining. It looked like the foragers would have to fast for a while, but fortunately, that would not be necessary. On the third morning, before the sun had chased away the last traces of night, Squanto came running through the forest, his breath forming white clouds in the chill air. He told them that Massasoit, the sachem, or chief of the Wampanoag, wanted to see them and requested that they send a delegation to meet him at the riverbank. Our friend Squanto also told them that Massasoit wanted the men to bring their hunting knives and axes with them. All the pilgrims were wondering what was going on. Some thought that the chief had grown tired of their presence and wanted to drive them away. When Tisquantum heard their fears, he told them not to worry. He would go with them and make sure that nothing happened. While the others prepared themselves for the meeting, Tisquin went back to the village to tell Massasoit that the men would come, but that it would take them a while. Then, he returned to the pilgrims with an armload of dried fish, which he told them they must cook immediately and bring to the riverbank. They were to do this without asking any questions. After the food was ready, the men set out for the riverbank, their weapons at their sides and their eyes sharp and alert. It wasn't far to go, and soon they saw that something was waiting for them by the river. Their first surprise was that instead of 1 boat, as they had expected, there were 5. But the biggest surprise was what they saw inside the boats. In each boat sat a man, and each man held a hatchet in his hand. This meant only one thing. Each of the men in the boats was a sachem, or chief, from a different tribe. One of the men was the chief of the Nipmuc, another, the chief of the Nipmuc. Among them was the chief of the Cape Cod and the chief of Martha's Vineyard, but the men were too busy greeting their hosts with loud voices and bear hugs to pay much attention to the gifts of fish. Still, the pilgrims knew better than to make any moves against the guests. After all, they were outnumbered. So they split up the fish among the 7 canoes and rowed it back to shore. As they unloaded the fish, Massasoit stood up in his canoe and spoke to the pilgrims. He said that the other chiefs had come because they had heard about the feast that the pilgrims were having. They had come to ask if they could join the feast. In return, they had brought gifts for the pilgrims, gifts that would ensure the feast would never end. The pilgrims accepted the offer and welcomed the chiefs and their followers to join them at the table. After all, there was enough food for everyone. There were 20 fattened deer that had been killed especially for the feast, as well as plenty of wild fowl and shellfish. Pumpkins grew so wild in New England that the foragers hardly had to work for them. They simply picked them up as they walked through the fields. And so there were hundreds of pumpkins for the feast. When the men had finished unloading the fish and distributing the gifts, Massasoit asked them to show him their hunting knives and axes. He told them that these were the tools of the hunter and the woodman, tools used for survival and for providing food. These were the tools of men who worked hard and were not afraid of anything, but now they would put these tools aside. Now they would use something else. Massasoit then reached into his canoe and pulled out 5 long poles, each one as thick as a man's wrist and nearly as tall as a man himself. He handed 1 pole to each of the pilgrims and told them to hold it like a spear. This was a symbol of war, a symbol of strength and power. Then Massasoit did something that surprised the pilgrims even more. He dropped his pole into the river. The other chiefs did the same. At first, the pilgrims thought that this was a sign of aggression, that the natives were getting ready to attack them. But then Massasoit spoke again. He told the Pilgrims that by dropping their spears into the water, they were showing that they did not want to go to war. They were showing that they did not want to hurt anyone. They were showing that they were peaceful people. Then, it was time for the ceremony to begin. The Pilgrims held their poles aloft and shouted as loud as they could. Then they dropped their poles into the river and shouted again. And then, as if by magic, the poles were gone. They had disappeared beneath the surface of the water. The Pilgrims were stunned. Where had the poles gone? Had they really just vanished? Suddenly, Squanto emerged from the bushes. In his hand, he held a large net filled with fish. With a great flourish, he pulled the net out of the river and held it aloft for all to see. The fish flopped and splashed in the net, and the Pilgrims could hardly believe their eyes. It was as if the very river itself had given them a gift. And indeed it had, for, in the natives' culture, the river was considered a living being, a great mother who provided for her children. The ceremony was over. The men helped each other out of their canoes and then stood in a circle on the shore. Massasoit took a deer and cut it into 5 pieces, 1 piece for each of the chiefs and 1 piece for the Pilgrims. Then the men helped each other carry the deer to the great table under the spreading branches of the ancient oaks. When the men arrived at the table, they found that it was covered with even more food than before. There were dozens of pumpkins, each one bigger than a man's head. And inside each pumpkin were kernels of corn, so fresh and so sweet that the Pilgrims could eat them right away. There were also clams, mussels, and lobsters, all gathered by the women and children. Tisquanum had told them that the best way to cook the lobsters was to bury them in the ground with hot stones. They would steam for hours, and the result would be worth it. The men sat down to eat, and as they ate, they told stories of their travels. The natives told the Pilgrims how they had explored the coast in their canoes, and the Pilgrims told the natives about their long journey across the sea. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the men grew hungrier and hungrier. And when the feast was finally over, there was not a morsel of food left, not 1 scrap of meat, not 1 kernel of corn, not 1 drop of cider. The men were so full that they could eat no more, and so they lay down on the soft grass and fell asleep. When they woke up, they saw that the women and children had cleared away all the dishes and were playing games nearby. The men joined in the games, and soon everyone was laughing and having a good time. The foragers stayed at the riverbank for 3 days, and during that time, they feasted on the bounty of the land. They caught fish in the river and gathered fruit and vegetables in the fields. They hunted deer and wild fowl in the forest, and they picked up pumpkins as they walked along. The Pilgrims had brought tools with them from England, tools that the natives had never seen before. They showed the natives how to use the tools to build houses and plant crops. In return, the natives showed the Pilgrims how to use their bows and arrows to hunt, how to track animals through the forest, and how to find food and shelter in the wilderness. When it was time for the Pilgrims to leave, they were sad to part ways with their new friends, but they knew that they must go. They had a long journey ahead of them, and they needed to start soon. The Pilgrims said goodbye to Massasoit and the other chiefs, and then they turned and walked away from the riverbank. As they walked, they looked back. They wanted to get one last glimpse of the great table under the spreading branches of the ancient oaks. But the table was nowhere to be seen. In its place was a clearing, a place where the Pilgrims had feasted and made friends, a place where they had learned how to survive in the wilderness, a place where they had discovered the true meaning of friendship. So what does this story teach us about the Wampanoag people? First, we learn that they were very welcoming to the Pilgrims. Despite the fact that the Pilgrims were strangers, the Wampanoag were willing to share their food and their knowledge. Second, we learned that the Wampanoag were very generous. They did not hold back any of their food or their resources. They were willing to give the Pilgrims everything they needed to survive. Finally, we learned that the Wampanoag were very peaceful. Despite the fact that they were warriors, they were willing to put down their weapons and live in harmony with the Pilgrims. Now, it's your turn to share your thoughts. What did you think of this story? How do you think the Wampanoag people viewed the Pilgrims? Why do you think the Wampanoag were so welcoming, generous, and peaceful? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this one. Thanks for watching. See you next time.